Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining me today. We're here to talk about some of the new features that went into TreeAge Pro 2022. I'll use this as an agenda. There are some other things that went into this release, but these are the kind of more important ones, starting from the top and moving down. So let me get this out of the way, and we'll start talking about TreeAge Pro instead of, or start looking at TreeAge Pro instead of Word. And we're going to start with the topic of full strategy Markov reporting. Okay, and all the models we'll use today are somewhere in this files view. Most of them are healthcare models. And we're going to start with the model Markov split strategy. So you'll be able to do these things on your own as well. So Markov split strategy here. And what we have here is a model that has a strategy. Now, there's only one strategy, but imagine there's multiple strategies. But that strategy got split into two subgroups in this case. But it could be split for any reason into different Markov processes. Like you could have an initial treatment that either succeeds or fails, and this could be the people for whom it succeeds, and this could be the people for whom it fails. But then you're following those people out further into the future. And for a very, very long time, you've been able to run, in fact, from as long as I've known, you've been able to run Markov cohort analyses at the Markov node. So I'm just going to run it here, right? And what you have here is really just the first subgroup, all the data related to that first Markov node, but it's not giving you reporting for the entire strategy. And of course, I could come down here and I could run it down here. Remember, this is all part of the same strategy, and run the same report. And you have basically two reports that reflect the specific Markov processes. But what you never could have before, and people have asked for this several times, is, well, I want a summary of what's happening for the whole strategy. When I give everyone this particular strategy, I want a summary of all the people that got the strategy, whether they went into this Markov process or into this Markov process. So that's the new feature. So yes, you could always run the ones at the two individual Markov processes, but now, assuming it's all the strategy ends in Markov processes, you could go to the strategy level, and you can't run the details report because there's too many differences there could be amongst the different Markov processes, but you can run the basic report. And what you get now is a consolidated view of the entire strategy. Let me make it a little bigger. Right, broken down into the subgroups or the processes within that strategy. So just going back to the model for a second, right? We had a strategy here, and we had it broken down into two subgroups. Well, the consolidated report has the two subgroups and the states within the subgroups. And they're weighted based on how likely it would be for any patient to go into one subgroup or the other, or one Markov process and the other. So if we go back to the model, you see there's 80% of our population is in subgroup 1 and 20% the complement in subgroup 2. So what do we get in our model? We get 80% of our cohort in this Markov process and 20% in this Markov process, right? If we look at the individual Markov processes, it's everyone, right? Because we just ran it for this Markov process. But this, actually that's subgroup 2, but here let's look at subgroup 1. Subgroup 1 here, right? That's everyone in the local cancer state. But when you look at it as part of the overall strategy, it's essentially only 80% of the overall strategy. So you end up with 0.8 in the local cancer state, reflecting the people in that subgroup, and the 0.2 of the overall cohort in the second Markov process within the strategy. And then as you carry it forward, right, of these 80%, right, now you're down to 84%, and in the other one, you're down to 80%. So some blended a percentage of those is going to be in the overall one. Actually, I picked the wrong one, but you're seeing the 80% and the 20%, and a percentage of the 80% and a percentage of the 20% will remain in the local cancer state. I didn't say that particularly well, but essentially you're taking the details of the two individual cohort processes, presenting them in a consolidated report, but everything out here, including the cohort percentage and all the cost effectiveness and any other payoff are weighted based on the understanding that, look, only 80% of the overall cohort that receives this strategy is actually in that process. And if I run something like the state prob report, I'm going to have now a lot of states, right? Here's the 80% in local cancer in the first subgroup. Here's the 20% in local cancer in the second subgroup. And of course, they both go down over time. And here are the people dying in the first subgroup, and here are the people dying in the second subgroup. And this could never get any higher than 80%. And this could never get any higher than 20%. So that's the general concept of combining the overall cohort output into a single strategy level value. Now, I want to show you something more, but I'm just going to check the chat for questions. Okay, no questions so far. So let me close this and go back to the consolidated report and say, well, okay, yeah, you gave me the two subgroups, this process, the separate processes within the overall strategy. Well, now I want to just merge them. I want to see who's in local cancer versus metastases versus dead. So the initial output will break it down by the two Markov processes. But if I go to collapse states, it will give me the option to combine them all into a smaller set of states. So by default, it'll say, okay, if the names are all the same, let's just assume you want the same names. And that's what I'm going to do. But if I wanted to do it differently, I could add more, like if I wanted local cancer split, but I wanted the other two consolidated, I could add more states and associate them in any way that I want. But I'm just going to use the defaults and say, I know there were two subgroups within the strategy, but I want the 80% and the 20% presented as all being in local cancer. So if I click OK now I get this combined group, right? So it's showing data from both of the two Markov processes within the strategy. And sure enough, everyone is a local cancer state. And then slowly you see people progress and die until at the end, you have 76.2% dead, right? Now, if you looked at each one, they wouldn't be 76.2% dead. In the first group, it was 76.7%. And in the second group, it was 74.2%. So we know that combined, when you bring them together, it's going to be in between those. And that's why we end up with 76.2%. And now all the secondary reports, like over here, like the state prob, is now showing you everyone starting local cancer. That's each of the two subgroups. And by the end, this is how many people were dead. That's each of the two subgroups combined together. So you have options to do it in a consolidated manner or in an individual cohort manner, but all part of the same set of reporting options. And that's essentially what we have for you, the ability to look at a strategy as a whole, even if it breaks down into individual Markov processes within that. And that's all I had to show you for that particular one. Remember, the example model is right here in the files view, if you wanted to do it yourself. But before, I'll just check and see if there's any questions on that before we move on to the next topic. Okay, no questions, so I'll move on. And feel free to ask questions later, that's fine. The next thing I want to talk about is the new simulation output. Okay, so I'm going to close all this stuff. Close all. And I'm just first I'm going to run a microsimulation model. So I'm just going to use this this model, microsimulation cancer model. Now, why is it a microsimulation model? That means it's a patient simulation model. So there are elements in this of heterogeneity, and there are other elements of patient history that are in this model that require you to run patients through rather than process at a cohort model. That's not really the topic we're going to talk about today in terms of why you would do microsimulation. But for any of you who have run microsimulation, it's just this one, or it's here, analysis, Monte Carlo simulation, trials, that's patients. And I'm going to run 10,000 patients through this model. And what you used to get was just a presentation of a whole lot of data, just a big table of data that looked a little bit like this, just a big chunk of data, which was not very illustrative of what is actually being run here. So now what we've chosen to give you is what we think is a far superior presentation is, well, what did I run? I ran microsimulation, patient simulation. I ran 10,000 patients. It's a cost-effectiveness model, and my willingness to pay is 50,000. And this is a trend. It's basically a histogram of individual patients, what happened to the patients. But instead of showing the individual bars, instead we have the trend line. So you see, basically the two strategies resulted in very, very similar, but not exactly the same outputs on a patient, across our patient group. To give you a feel for, okay, well, there's a mean here, and the mean net benefits is higher, meaning less negative in this case for treatment 1 than treatment 2. So treatment 1 was overall the more cost effective, and it's also showing you the variance amongst the patients who experience each of these treatments. So we just thought that a graphical representation of the outputs was more helpful than a big a table of data. And you can either do it on net monetary benefits if you have a good willingness to pay, or you could look at the costs. Here's how the costs varied amongst the patients within each strategy, right? Treatment 2 was clearly more expensive. We know it was more expensive at the mean level, and we should expect our trend to be a little higher. And if we look at effectiveness, we see treatment 2 was a little bit more effective. Not a lot, but a little bit more. And that's a distribution of our patients across the whole strategy. And you'll notice a huge variance, right? From 0 to almost 20, right? Indicating, look, every patient's going to have a different outcome. We don't know what's going to happen to each patient. We know that there's going to be a huge amount of variance, but when we're looking at the strategy as a whole, we're really using the mean values to determine which is the optimal strategy. Although we can't guarantee good outcomes for any individual in either strategy. And then from there, we simplified and consolidated some of these secondary outputs so that you can run things like rankings right here. There used to be, dozens and dozens of links. We shortened the list, added more outputs that are have secondary options. So it's easier to find the outputs that you want. Like the rankings is most likely the first thing you'd go to, which is give me the ICER and give me the net benefits and tell me which one is optimal. And we consider a willingness to pay of 50,000, then treatment 1 would be considered the optimal strategy. So we just really wanted to, as people run simulations, have a better understanding of what did they run and what do I necessarily want to look at as my next step. Okay, I'm going to show a PSA model too, but I'm just going to check the chat for any questions. Okay, no questions. So let me close all of this. I right click and say close all. I'm not going to change the model, and I'm going to move on to a new model for showing PSA, and I just want to make sure I open the right model. We're going to use the Markov PSA final. We'll just use this model for now. It's just a standard Markov model with a set of distributions that represent parameter uncertainty. So I'm going to be sampling these distributions, recalculating the model, and I'm really looking for how frequently each strategy is considered the most cost effective. Now, as a baseline, let's just run the rankings for the whole model, and you see that overall treatment 3 is the most optimal strategy. But we know that as we vary our inputs, that won't always be true. And the more often it's true, the more confidence we can have in this conclusion. But I just want to remind myself and everyone else, which is the optimal strategy at the baseline. Now let's run the PSA. This die with the little, the analyzed layout, this die with the little normal curve over it is probabilistic sensitivity analysis. I'm running it. And the output will look similar, but there'll be some significant differences. First of all, look, there's a lot less variance because now we're talking about individual calculations of the model as opposed to individual patients running through the model. So every patient could have totally different outcomes, but the general reporting of the whole strategy is not going to change that much as you vary these inputs. So you don't see as much variance here. And we can see that the mean net benefits for our third strategy is the highest, right? That makes sense because that's what our baseline told me. But you can see there's some overlap. So we shouldn't expect it to be always the most cost-effective strategy. And up here in this primary table here, we see that almost 70% of the time, treatment 3 was the optimal strategy, which is pretty good confirmation of our base case. It's not, perfect. You should never really expect to get 100% here, but 69% of our calculations confirming our base case is pretty good. We can feel confident making that recommendation. And you notice that the outputs are different, right? The other one wouldn't have had these PSA outputs available to you. So we're trying to get you right to the reports that you want as quickly as possible. And then, of course, we have it on net benefits. We also have it on cost. You see treatment 3 was clearly the most costly, and treatment 3 was clearly the most effective. This is not an accident. I use a simple model here to illustrate the point. And then, of course, your options for secondary outputs, with the PSA being the most common one that you'd use. Here's your acceptability curve, right? As the willingness to pay goes up, right? More and more of our iterations are going to favor treatment 3. And at 50,000, that's where you got nearly 70%. Common output. I'll show you the ICE scatter plot too. Now, if you remember the old one, there might have been, 6 or 8 different links for this. Now there's one, and you choose the willingness to pay, and you say, let's say I want treatment 3 as the comparator and treatment 2 as the baseline. So rather than having dozens of links, it's just a little easier to get to the report you want. And you see all these green points below and to the right of the willingness to pay line favor treatment 3 over treatment 2. So essentially, we just tried to reorganize this in a way to make it easier to understand what the simulation is generating, and easier to get the outputs that are of interest to follow up and interpret the results. And that's all I have to say on that one. Yes, you could run PSA and microsimulation together, or you could run EVPPI, like a double loop probabilistic sensitivity analysis. I'm not going to do that now. They'd all look similar to this in terms of the way the output is presented. Let me check the chat for questions. No questions so far. Please don't hesitate. I'd be happy to take. Oh, here's a question. Oh, all right. I like someone's happy. Yevgeny, thanks for liking it. I just really felt like when you were looking at basically this as your first output from these, it was, especially for beginners, it was really hard to know what you're looking at. And we really feel strongly that this back here is a better way to get a good understanding of the simulation results. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next topic, which is combining graphs. Okay, another thing that people have been asking for a long time. Now, I'm not going to tell you combine every graph, but some of the ones that people were really most interested in, we're going to look at, and we've implemented and we're going to look at. So let me close that, and I'm going to open up another model. This time I'll open up the Markov conversion model. And we happen to use it to show conversions, but it's really, again, just a simple example Markov model. And the idea here is, yeah, I can generate cohort analysis, right? I'll do my cohort analysis, and I can get, let's say, a survival curve for the first strategy. And I could do the same thing for the second strategy, right? Generate the cohort analysis, generate a survival curve, right? There's the one dead state. But essentially what I was never able to do is say what I want is I want to be able to see the survival of the two strategies in the same graph. Like, don't make me export it to Excel and do all that work myself. So I think this is the first strategy and this is the second strategy. I may have gotten that mixed up, but you notice there's a little combine button here now. This is new. So I think this is the second strategy. If I click combine, it'll allow me to link in the second one, click OK. And now let me just make it bigger. Out here. Where is it? I think I may have closed it. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to do that again because and when I was moving these things around, I managed to screw myself. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Here it is. I put it in the wrong place. So here's my two strategies. Now I just happen to know that the blue is treatment 2 because I know that treatment 2 had better survival than treatment 1. And it doesn't really help that they both say survival, but I can go into this Markov survival options and go to the series and say, this one was treatment 2. And this one was treatment 1, right? And now you can see the combined survival curves for the two strategies together. And you can illustrate the point of the impact of your strategy of let's say this is the standard of care and this is a new strategy, you can emphasize the difference between what you can expect for your population if you move to a new strategy. One thing that's also in here that we don't need for this is when you go to the series, you can actually exclude series from the graph. So for example, if we did the state prob graph and we wanted to see who was still, pre-progression or progression free, we could have a state prob graph combined with 6 different states and just say, I only want to see these 2. And you'd be able to take the greater graph with a whole bunch of line series, I should say, and just show the ones you want. So there are only a few graphs that we've implemented it for. We did it for the ones we thought were most useful. One's the survival curve I just showed. One is the state prob graph, so the percentage in each state for Markov, and also the Partitioned survival curve, so the partition survival analysis models survival curve. We can combine those as well. We may combine more or add functions to combine more in the future if we find a need. If someone says, I'd really like to combine these 2 graphs or 2 occurrences of the same graph of this type. So if you have any ideas, I'm very open to it now or in the future. I'm going to go back to the questions and say, can we conduct a test such as log rank text for the survival curves? No, we don't have regression analysis tools that will go and look for kind of parametric equations that represent those. That's really not outside what we're trying to do as a predictive modeling tool, but I certainly see that would be valuable. It's just not part of our software. Any other questions before we move on to another topic? Okay, so our next topic is Bilinks improvements. Now, the Bilinks functionality is not new. This is something that you've been able to do for a long time. I'm just going to open up. Now, the Bilinks models are down here in Special Features Excel. And I'm just going to open up this Markov Cancer Bilinks. And what you'll see in this model is that there's a lot of variables that are defined with this Bilink name function. Okay, what that means is this value is actually in Excel. So not that one, sorry. Or this one. Here it is. I can't seem to bring up the Excel, but there's named cells in Excel that relate back to these. And the way that's set up, and this isn't particularly new, is in tree preferences. And any value that's in Excel, these are all named cells in Excel, can be pulled back into your model and used as inputs. So what that allows you to do is potentially give someone a spreadsheet, say, give me all the parameters you want, and I'll just attach them to my model. And I'm not sure why I'm unable to show the Excel. I'm struggling a little bit with that. But what's changed is we've rearranged this screen to make it much easier to do, right? Model inputs from Excel. And the biggest change is we've added this new variable option. So you can choose a variable from the list and it will automatically delete whatever definition was here. So let's say this said like $10,000. It will replace that with a reference to the Excel. So we found that people weren't using Bilinks partly because they were struggling to set them up. So essentially all we did with this release is change these screens around and add this column to automatically assign it to a variable, just to make that a much easier process to work through. So that's all we did on the Bilinks. Any questions on that before I continue to the last topic for us today? Okay, and then the last thing is variable set consistency. So variable sets may be a function that you've never used, but I'm going to use a model, or what's it called? Markov price threshold model, right here. And I typically use this to demo price threshold, which is not what I'm going to do now. But essentially what I wanted to show you is there are 2 variable sets, right? There's a variable set for low risk patients, and there's a variable set for high risk patients. Okay, and they're different. Now, most of the variables are the same. And I can use this, we added this to this menu. So you can see, okay, these are the only two variables that are different. All the other variable definitions are the same. So imagine in this case, we have low risk and high risk patients. So those are two subgroups. And when we want to run the model for the low risk patients, we changed all the variables to use this variable set and run the model. And we want to run it for high risk group patients. We just changed the variable set to use the high risk variable, the variables to use the high risk variable set, and it will use these values. But most of the values are the same. I don't know, there's a dozen or so variables, only these two are different. So what I found when I tried to use variable sets was it was unwieldy, because I wanted to change parameters and I had to change it 2 or 3 different places, depending on how many variable sets, and I would end up with inconsistent values that I didn't want. Okay, so there were 2 keys to helping with that. One is the variable set differences, so you know what's different. And the second is, let's imagine we change one of the other variables, like it doesn't even matter which one it is. Let's say this price treatment 2. If I change that from 6,000 to 8,000, theoretically, because it's 6,000 in both variable set, I should probably want to change it in both. I'm not sure I want to change it both, but I may want to change it in both. So when I hit enter, it's going to say, okay, look, you're changing it in the current high risk patient set. Since the original values were equal, do you also want to change it in this one? If I didn't want to, I would just uncheck this and click OK, or I could click cancel. But if I leave it checked and click OK, then it has set the value to 8,000 in both the high risk and the low risk sets. So it gives you the opportunity to try to help keep the variable definitions that you want to be consistent across variable sets consistent. And that's all I have on that. I'm going to go back and take some questions in a second, but that was the last thing I wanted to cover. So Kate, I see that you like the options on variable sets. I'm glad you do, because I felt people weren't using them because it was too awkward and too easy to make mistakes. So hopefully these things will help with that. And then Cecilia, you have for the PSA output, could you test the differences across 2 or more strategies? I mean, yes, you are always testing the difference across 2 or more strategies, but some particular secondary outputs only make sense for 2 strategies. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'm just going to try to address it. So if I go back to the PSA model, when we run PSA, notice the selected node is the decision node. If I had selected this node, it would only run that strategy. But with the selected node being that, we are actually running all 3 strategies. Okay, so you're seeing results for all 3 strategies compared. Some of the secondary reports, like any ones that have I incremental in them, right? Those are all going to require that you choose a comparator and a baseline, and it'll be the value of this strategy minus the value of this strategy. So incremental level graphs require a selection of a comparator and baseline. And you'll see that both for that, which I didn't actually run, or any of the PSA histograms. So if I wanted to run incremental net benefits, I'd have to say, well, I want the difference between 2 and 1. And it would show me the overall difference in incremental net benefits between treatment 2 and treatment 1. So the overall results are for all the strategies. And some of the things like net benefits, that's you're going to pick one strategy, and others that are incremental, you choose a comparator and a baseline. So hopefully that addressed the question, but send a follow-up if I didn't. That's really all I had to share today, but I'm certainly open to take questions if people have questions they'd like to ask. Okay, so the t-tests and CI. So I don't think that t-tests apply in this particular in modeling framework as opposed to real data framework. But in terms of confidence intervals, you can get statistic data. So if I go up to the statistics, right, this is going to give you, now I'm going to give you 2 levels of statistics in terms of what we call prediction intervals, because we don't like to use the term confidence intervals when we're talking about model data as opposed to actually gathered patient data. But in terms of the prediction interval, this 2.5 and this 97.5 is related to the calculations. So this is, 95% of the calculations for cost for treatment one fall within the range of 440 and 451,000, right? If you're looking for prediction interval of the mean, meaning how stable can we consider this mean to be, this is a 95% prediction interval in terms of how far off the mean could be, right? So I want to be very careful about the difference between those two things, right? When we're talking about variance related to the variance related to the individual calculations reflecting different parameter outliers, possibly, we're talking about these two. But when we're talking about, well, how far off could the mean be, and especially when you're talking about micro simulation, where the mean is your primary focus for your main baseline or base case calculations, then this is showing you how far off this mean could be. And the more iterations you run, the tighter this will get, the more confidence we can have that this mean is correct if we run more and more iterations in the simulation itself. Any other questions before we break? Okay, well, I got another question. So Kate, if you're talking about confidence around the comparison of a model data, you also we always prefer prediction interval. I mean, now that we may be very persnickety about it. I am always concerned about talking about confidence intervals when it's modeled data. I feel much more comfortable talking about confidence intervals when it's observed data, real patients. So I try to avoid the use of the confidence interval whenever I can. And that doesn't mean I don't get questions like every week about confidence interval, but I try to reply by saying, we like to refer to it as prediction interval to be what we consider to be more statistically accurate. Okay, well, I think we're done. All right, well, thank you, Melissa. I feel much better about that now. And I want to thank Melissa and Kate and Evgeny, everyone everyone who asked questions, everyone who didn't ask questions. Thank you all for joining me today. And one last thing I say is, look, we want to make the software better. So if you have any ideas, we want to hear about them because we can get them into future releases, and we want to make software work for you as best we can. So with that, I'm going to break off, and you can look for more webinars in the future. And thank you all for joining me today.